Okay, so let me start by discussing something that came up talking to a few participants yesterday that's a point of clarification. So we have two concepts that both involve a change in mean. One is the selection differential, the what do I call it? The linear selection differential, S, which is just the change in mean. Now that's the change in mean within a generation. So we're thinking of a life cycle in which we start with individuals who grow up to maturity and during that process undergo selection. And then after a big lifetime episode of selection, then they reproduce and produce the next generation. It's the simplest life cycle to deal with. It works pretty well. We're thinking of S as the shift in mean that happens within a generation during that selection episode, before reproduction, okay? And there could be a figurative statistical shift in the mean. Then there's reproduction, and there's offspring, and that shift in the mean gets transmitted across generations to the offspring generation, and now they express a population mean. The change from the mean of individuals in one generation to the next, that's delta z bar. That includes both selection and transmission to the next generation, right? So that's the shift in mean across a single generation, or from one generation to the next. I was going to diagram this. So if you think about this, this is a really important distinction to realize that in one case we're within a generation, and in the next we've gone across generations. So that's why, of course, when we write delta z bar, there's an inheritance term, right? Because you've got to take the selection differential and transmit that, if you want to think of it that way, across generations. Okay. Again, today we'll talk about selection. We've talked about selection a couple of times. We had a whole lecture devoted to it last time, univariate, multivariate selection. That was pretty much the algebra of selection to introduce you to two key concepts, beta and gamma, the directional and nonlinear, the directional and nonlinear selection gradients. Jessica pointed out that she likes a visual view, and so do I. And so it's a natural thing to think of these selection concepts in terms of surfaces, and that's what we're going to do today. I'm not going to go into. I was tempted to launch into the history of the surface viewpoint, and actually the surfaces that let me just talk about for an instant. The idea of a selection surface like this probably traces mostly to Wright, but the kind of surface we're talking about in which the dimensions of the surface are some trait dimension, that's something that Simpson thought about and wrote a lot about in 1944 and 1954 in his books, Tempo and Mode and the Major Features of Evolution. And it's that Simpsonian concept of a selection surface in trait measurement space that Landy in particular translated it into the kind of surface view that we're going to talk about today. And in particular, that view of adaptive landscapes. Okay, but so much for history. There's a little bit of it in the notes, but we're going to focus on concepts and some examples. Here are our main points today. There'll be I haven't numbered them, I guess. They're mainly three. The first one is that we can think of selection as a surface. And of course, we get a visualization of selection, which is a very compact way about thinking about the many different features of selection. So if you look in the evolutionary biology literature, it's common to say selection. And that sort of drives me crazy because, there are many aspects to selection. And to just say selection doesn't tell us too much. Like everything else, this term in evolutionary biology is most understood if you can conceptualize it with a model. So we're gonna think of different surface views of selection. It's not just a matter of visualization. In the process of estimating the parameters for these surfaces, we're actually estimating selection parameters. So we can show that we're doing that at the same time. Now, as we think about estimation, we need to make a distinction between three kinds of surfaces. Well, basically just two. The individual selection surface, which is selection in the space of individual trait measurements on individuals. And then we need to think of the adaptive landscape, which is fitness, average fitness in a surface in which the dimensions are at the average trait value for a population. And in between those, we have the approximation of the individual selection surface, which is going to tell us something about the adaptive landscape. So if you find yourself getting fused in the discussion, if we're talking about a surface, it's going to be just one of these three things. So, but it's extremely helpful to have all three concepts. So you can imagine we're going to trip through all three of those surface ideas. What? You don't have your dedicated microphone over there? Let me deliver it.
Why do we need number 2 to deal with number 1, like the approximation of 1, but we can deal with 3 directly? Why don't we need our approximation of an adaptive landscape?
Well, we're going to approximate the individual selection surface. So just in a nutshell, when we think of the individual selection surface, it could be some complex, crazy thing. I mean, it could have bumps and grinds in it. And that kind of a complex surface that Richard Dawkins, for example, likes to draw is mathematically a little difficult to deal with. I mean, you could represent selection always as 11th degree polynomial, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to try and get by with a really simplified version of the, ecologically God-given surface that populations are really exposed to, and we're going to get by with a quadratic, simple, smooth surface that's going to be a kind of crude representation. And it's important to realize that we're doing that. If you're an ecologist, you're going to probably grind your teeth when we show you these approximations that are just quadratic or even linear. And I know people have that reaction, but they do estimate the selection parameters that we're interested in. And likewise, the adaptive landscape that we're going to look at is a very simple thing. It's going to have a single peak, or a single optimum, or a single pessimum. And what we're trying to do, the mathematical view that's most practical, is to think of this surface in the immediate vicinity of the population mean. And that surface probably doesn't have pits and valleys and so forth. They might be out there somewhere, but we're just trying to approximate the surface and the adaptive landscape pretty close to the population mean. And we'll show you the empirical justification for that. Okay, here's our outline. We're going to start with the individual selection surface. This is the real thing out there. We're going to abbreviate it ISS. We're going to talk about approximations to the ISS. And then we're going to talk about the third kind of landscape, the adaptive landscape. I like to approximate it AL, so I don't have to write it out every time. We'll give you a couple of examples and a few surveys. One of the surveys is going to provide a justification for thinking about selection surfaces in the immediate vicinity of the mean. In parts 1 through 4, we're going to be univariate. We're going to have fitness of some kind as a function of a single trait value. And then 5, we're going to pull back on our multivariate throttle. We're going to go into bivariate space and then in n-dimensional space. And we're going to go through the same 3 points. We're going to look at the multivariate ISS. We're going to look at how we can approximate that in simple ways. And then we're going to look at the multivariate adaptive landscape. And then we're going to look at some examples and surveys. And maybe I'll even have the appropriate conclusions for this actual talk instead for the preceding one. I hope that's true. All right, ready? Okay, so I recently heard one of my daughters give a talk on PowerPoint presentations, and this is way too busy. This is way too busy, and it gets more difficult. It gets busier from here. But I sat back and I thought, oh boy, I'm glad my daughter Hillary's not here. And then I thought, well, there's a justification because over the preceding 2 days, I've trained you to my. You're used to my slides. You're ready for more complexity, right? You're not scared or horrified. is true? Raise your hands if you're, no, I won't even do that. Okay. All right, but here we are. Okay, so now I'm in 3 colors today. We've gone from 2 to 3. So that's good or bad. And what I'm going to say here is, in red, I've got the takeaway message from the slide. So, at least read this before you go back to your email. So the main point here of the individual selection surface is that this is the expected fitness of an individual as a function of trait value. And when we're in univariate space, it's always going to be an orange throughout today, and always in my talks. It's always going to be an orange. And here I've drawn 3 simple kinds of ISSs, and I've shown in blue a normal distribution of a trait distribution before selection, and then just the same distribution of individuals after selection in black. And then I've shown you a linear straight line ISS. Here's one that is a simple stabilizing. Everybody would call this stabilizing selection. It's centered right over the population mean. It doesn't change the mean, but it affects the variance. Here's a simple disruptive selection surface. It expands the variance without changing the mean. Now let me go back to this linear surface. As we'll see, if you think back to our equations, if you apply them, this linear function obviously shifts the mean, but it also contracts the variance a little bit. And we've already talked about the degree to which this function contracts the variance. What's that term? S squared. Hey, wow, you're on it. Okay, here's a function that both shifts the mean and contracts the variance. And there's diversity about what you call this. I would call this stabilizing selection because it certainly has this effect of stabilizing, changing the variance. And people will argue, there are people that want this peak of the fitness function to be within a standard deviation of the mean before selection to call it stabilizing. And then beyond that, they go, well, it's nonlinear selection. So I kind of hate that, but I bow to the community. And that's why we're always going to call curved surfaces nonlinear, whether they're close to the mean or far away in their peak, should they have one. If this is curved, we're going to call that nonlinear. And we're going to reserve, we're going to call only that kind of function linear. Just, that's the way we're going to do it, just from the standpoint of terminology. Okay, so how does beta relate to such a surface? Well, it's the weighted average of the slopes of the individual selection surface. So let me just do it graphically. Here's our selection surface before selection. Here's the ISS. If we move along this orange curve, and at every point weight the first derivative, the slope of the orange slope, by the frequency of phenotypes at that point, and then just keep doing that weighted average, we'll end up with a weighted average slope, and that turns out to be equivalent to beta. And basically all we have to assume to make that happen is that the individual selection surface before the trait distribution has to be normal before selection, and we get that result. And here it is in integral form. Here's the expression for the first derivative of the surface at a particular point z. And we're doing, this is our weighted average. We're weighting that first derivative by the trait frequency at each position. So this is a weighted average, just as we've seen before, and that's equivalent to beta. So that's nice. Raise your hand if you want it to stop. Same thing for gamma. Gamma is the weighted second derivative. So if we calculated the curvature, the second derivative at each point, weighted it by the trait value at that point, just kept doing that, and summed it up, from minus infinity to plus infinity, that weighted average would turn out to be gamma. Now this is one of those times where I cheated. I didn't actually calculate gamma for this curve. I just, that's debatable. But it's pictorial. Okay, so that's the relationship of beta and gamma to the individual selection surface. Now we're going to shift to 2 approximations to the surface. Why are we going to do an approximation? Well, for one thing, it'll give us a way to approximate, it'll give us a way to estimate beta and gamma. And a way to estimate beta and gamma that's pretty robust and depends only on approximate normality of the trait distribution before selection. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about a function which we've been drawing in orange. We're going to call that W of z. Here's trait value z, and you can see that this is our standard equation for a straight line, except we've allowed for a little bit of error, right? And here's our coefficient beta for z, so that's the equation for a line. The slope of the line is b, and alpha is the intercept. When we say a quadratic surface, we're going to mean this surface in which there's an extra term involving z squared, and the coefficient for that quadratic term is going to be gamma. Notice that there's a factor of 1/2, a factor that has a notorious history in the literature. We're going to put a factor of 1/2 there so that gamma will be the second derivative of the simple function. Without it, gamma would be twice the second derivative. Okay? And so we want gamma to have that second derivative, meaning we put the factor of 1/2 there. Now, a lot of people who've estimated quadratic surfaces have forgot about a third of the people estimating them in the empirical literature since the mid-'80s left off the factor of 1/2. And so when we look at estimates of gamma, it's this nasty collage of estimates of gamma, twice gamma, sometimes half gamma. Sometimes people do it, anyways. You can consult a paper by Stinchcomb et al. 2 of the co-authors of that paper are in the room. Anyway, painful chapter. I'm not going to take responsibility for it. When John Stinchcomb contacted, my reaction was, "Oh God, did I fail to put the correct expression in any of my papers?" And I thought, I couldn't have done that because I've been talking about this in class for 20 years. So I went back and looked, and not only had I done it right, but I had the actual expression in every paper, the few papers I'd written on this. And so had all my students. So it's like, I think what happens, this is one of those lessons where if somebody, you go out and find one paper and somebody does something, you say, "Oh yeah, okay." And you don't look at any other papers. It's cool. But if they did it wrong, guess what? You're going to do it wrong too. So anyway, question? Yeah.
Stabilizing selection. And
say what?
Stabilizing selection.
You want to go back?
Not here.
Yeah, okay.
And we've got the peak of the surface, which is the same peak as the distribution of the trait
okay.
before selection. Beta is equal to 0. Am I correct? Because
then beta is going to be 0. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And alpha is going to be 0 too. So the all linear part is equal to 0.
I still didn't hear you. So beta. So this term, the beta is going to be 0 in that case, but you are going to have curvature.
Yeah. Because it's the
But alpha won't be 0.
Alpha won't be 0.
Yeah. Is that what you said? I didn't hear you say that.
Yeah. I mean, alpha won't be 0.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. In the back, Katie?
Just to bring it back to that graph with the
You wanna go
4
back
panels. So in the, can we go back?
Yeah, sure.
On the bottom left, that
there
would
we
be a
go.
case when beta is not 0 and gamma is not 0.
Hang on a second. Jeez. Which graph do you want? That one?
Yeah, that bottom left. Is that a case when beta is not 0 and gamma is not 0?
Here, beta and beta is not 0 and gamma is non-zero. Here beta is going to be 0, beta is going to be 0. Let's see, how does it work? The way I have to think about it is, here gamma is negative and here gamma is positive. If I'm remembering correctly, yeah.
This is a mathematical quibble. In the upper left curve there, it doesn't look sensible because the straight line, if you continued to the left, would give you a negative fitness. If instead you make it, I just wanted to note that if instead you make it an exponential curve, in which case it's always positive, then it has the interesting property that it will shift the mean without any change in the variance. A straight line will change it a little bit.
That's right.
But the straight line has this other problem.
Right.
But make it an exponential, and then it's a purer example of directional
Then
selection.
you've got pure directional selection.
Yeah, and the variance actually before and after selection is the same. If these are, normal distributions.
Yeah. Okay, but so, all right. So we're talking about now. Here you could say that what we're actually drawing here are these. Well, I don't want to go into additional detail. That's going to just take us off point. I'm going to scream along, but do stop me. Okay, so those are linear and quadratic approximations to the ISS. There are other ways to do the approximation. So, for example, our colleague Dolph Schluter worked in the Galapagos Island, and if you look at the distribution of seeds that are crackable by beak sizes of varying magnitude, that surface that you can imagine, you can approximate by gathering seeds and counting their frequency and knowing how beaks perform with seeds, is not a simple function. It's sort of a wavy, crazy thing. And so Dolph said, quadratic, I just don't, I'm trying to describe my ecology. And so here's an example in which he's fit a curve that's fit by the method of cubic splines. It's sort of a sliding window approach. But the point is, it's specifically designed to sort of represent and approximate the bumps and grinds of the individual selection surface. So this is sort of the primary way of going beyond a quadratic surface. If you're interested in the bumps and grinds, there are other ways to go. And this would be the primary case. But this approach doesn't estimate beta and gamma. So if you want to do that, you need to go back and do the quadratic approximation and maybe linear approximations as well as doing this. It's a question of what you want. And we'll make the same point in multivariate space. Okay, now let's talk about the adaptive landscape. What is it? It's something we've all heard about. Okay, so it is the surface of W bar, or the natural logarithm of mean fitness in the population, as a function of the trait average, Z bar, before selection. And so there is this nice result that we don't have to take any weighting average or anything. Beta is the first derivative of the adaptive landscape at the position of the population trait mean. Well, so it's actually the first derivative of the logarithm of W bar at the population mean. It's not quite as beautiful for gamma because there's an additional term, beta squared, but you're approximating gamma minus beta squared when you think about the curvature of the adaptive landscape in the vicinity of the population mean. So the point is this: if you estimate beta and you estimate gamma from the approximations I just told you, it tells you about the slope of the adaptive landscape at its curvature at one point, at the mean of the trait distribution. It's not a big window on the adaptive landscape, but it's not like some authors have said that we know nothing about the adaptive landscape. We cannot know that. That's not true. We have this little window when we do selection analysis that tells us about the adaptive landscape at this one point. Okay, let's see. I can't remember if I... Oh yes, okay, so this is where I was hoping we'd go. If we're doing modeling and conceptual work, our window gets much bigger on the adaptive landscape if we assume that the individual selection surface is Gaussian, shaped like a normal distribution. Now, if you think about the Gaussian distribution, a Gaussian function, there's a sort of annoying thing of it going off and sort of being bell-shaped. There's a sort of flaring out kind of thing. But if we think of weak selection so that the quadratic surface is like this and we approximate it with a Gaussian function, it's going to be a pretty good, in the case of weak stabilizing or nonlinear selection, it's going to be a pretty good approximation. So here's the result we're relying on. And I'm not going to go through any derivations, but you can sort of figure them out for yourself. Here's the equation for a normal distribution. And you can see it's an exponential of negative squared terms with the variance before selection playing this role. If we look at a Gaussian selection surface with an optimum at theta, and I'm going to draw this for you in a minute, and a width parameter omega, this is what Adam was alluding to yesterday. It's too bad I didn't do this first. Then the equation for the selection surface, the ISS, is this simple form. And if we think about the adaptive landscape that is implied by that individual selection surface, doing that weighting over the trait distribution, which we're assuming is normal before selection, then you get this simple form. You get this simple form telling us what the function is for the adaptive landscape, and we can draw the whole thing from that function. It too is Gaussian. We assume this is Gaussian, the trait distribution is Gaussian, then this is Gaussian. And it's a Gaussian curve with an optimum at theta, just like the ISS, and with a width that's 2 plus, that's omega plus the phenotypic variance before selection. And we're going to see this term a lot as we go forward, and we're going to come back to it in just a second. Omega plus p is going to be a term that we increases our heart rate every time we see it. I'll show you. All right, here's the first time our heart rate increases. We're still on the adaptive landscape. And, I forgot to say this, so let's say it now. Why do we care about the adaptive landscape? This is the surface on which the trait mean evolves, right? If we want to see the trait mean evolving, and how many of you want to see the trait mean evolving? I mean, that's what we're here to do. Yesterday, it was G evolving, and it should evolve on the adaptive landscape as well, because right at the center of the G matrix is the bivariate mean. Here we want to set the stage for a surface upon which our delta z bar vector can evolve, and this is that surface. And this, by making these Gaussian assumptions, now we can have a surface, a conceptual surface that we actually can specify, in which we can see the evolution of that trait mean, and we can model the evolution of the trait mean. That's what we're going to do later today. Okay, the first derivative of this Gaussian adaptive landscape, the first derivative is this function. The first derivative is proportional to the deviation of the trait mean from the optimum divided by, in the univariate case, this omega plus p factor. All right, so that's describing the first derivative, beta. And the second derivative is a similar term, and it's equivalent to gamma minus beta squared. Well, it's equivalent just to this term, which must then be representing the curvature of the adaptive landscape, right? Okay. Joe is puzzled?
Nothing that's important here. It's not a problem. Go ahead.
I can often,
Puzzled less expression of
after these many workshops together, I can often read your expressions, but not always.
thinking of bizarre modifications.
I don't want to go forward if you're not. This is our click and clack thing,
I'll
yeah.
try not to look up.
It's all right, it's all right. I always treasure your input.
When we've got WZ, we are talking about relative fitness every time.
When we're talking about,
WZ, so the fitness function.
oh, WZ, yes, yes,
It's
yes, we
relative
are.
fitness every time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because modeling papers most of the time, I don't find a clarification that we are talking about
Yeah,
relative fitness,
yeah.
and is intended as fitness, which is overestimate the importance of the trait.
Yeah, so we're talking about relative fitness. And you'll notice that when we do big W, we have a normalization factor to convert that into relative fitness, right? When you looked at my derivative, it was the derivative of big W, derivative, del Z bar, and then I had a W bar in the denominator. That was a normalization thing. Anyway, okay, so yeah, always relative fitness. All right, where are we here now? Okay. Okay, so let's think about red. Think about the red point here. In the Gaussian case, the adaptive landscape has the same optimum as the individual selection function, which is Gaussian here in orange, but it's flatter. So if you go back and look at the expression, they have the two curves, the Gaussian individual selection surface, which implies this Gaussian adaptive landscape. They have the same optimum, but in general, in this Gaussian case, the adaptive landscape is going to be a little flatter. But actually, not a lot flatter. It depends on the values. But so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Can be important. All right, we're just ready to wrap up the univariate case. So this is the approximation that Adam was talking about. In the empirical literature, there have been a lot of estimates of gamma. And I've taken those and then converted them into omega by this approximation. So remember, omega is the width of a Gaussian individual selection surface that we fit to this Gaussian approximation, right? And this is a little bit of a cheat because this is really only a good approximation when it's a relatively flat function. But in any case, what you get when you do this is so here we're looking at the strength of stabilizing or disruptive selection omega going from large positive values to large negative values. And we're looking at the number of observations in a sample of about 355 studies, okay? So so people get confused about omega. They get comfortable with gamma, but actually omega is easier to think about, right? Because you think of an individual selection surface that's Gaussian as like a bell curve, and this thing we're calling omega is like the variance of that distribution, that function. It's not a distribution, but instead of having a variance describing spread, it's got this thing that we're calling omega. So if I standardize to units of phenotypic standard deviation, then here we're saying there's a Gaussian curve shaped like this with a variance that's approximately equal 40 times the variance of the trait distribution before selection. And over here at minus 40, what is this? Well, that's a Gaussian distribution that's upside down, like this, but very wide and disruptive. So the signs here are the same signs as a normal distribution. So this is curved down. This is curved like this. And you can immediately have a visualization of what the width means. And you can see from this distribution, there's a preponderance of stabilizing like Gaussian functions. And over here, but there's a large number of cases in the literature of disruptive selections. Well, it's the same result we've been seeing all along, but here you can see it. And so why are we doing this? Well, we want to pick values for omega when we do our theoretical work that are in the ballpark of what we see empirically. And you can see that we really want to be choosing values in the stabilizing selection case that are not much more than say 30 or so, maybe 10, something like that.
Can-
Okay?
can- Now,
Anchors us in.
can I have
little-
make a puzzled expression?
Yeah.
I thought I heard you say that the omega was measured as multiples of the standard deviation of the character.
So I've standardized this so that all traits have a unit phenotypic standard deviation and hence variance before selection.
In your examples, or are you proposing
No, I've
that as-
standardized all of these studies.
in
all of
those
these-
in
all of
those
these estimates-
okay, so in this particular figure, that's what omega tells you.
That's right. Right.
But in general, when you use omega, you don't standardize it that way. I think the previous expression.
I always standardize it that way all through this talk. But when you look at the literature, you'd have to stop and ask. No, I think when Adam does omega, you standardize for the environment. Did you standardize it in this way?
No, but the phenotypic standard deviation is about 1.5.
It amounts pretty much to you standardize in terms of the E term,
Yeah, but the omega is not standardized.
when you go
because it yeah.
when you well, first of all, if you go back to your previous,
His variance is fluctuating with your phenotypic.
if you go
variance, so
back
can't
to your
standardize.
previous figures with the algebra, I'm not sure it's standardized there. And in multivariate cases where it's going to become a matrix, it's certainly not standardized. Because which character
see
would
what
you
you're saying.
standardize
Yeah,
it
yeah,
to?
yeah.
But I think in your math,
But
I
see,
I didn't see it being standardized in your math.
Yeah, maybe it's not.
You could back
standardized
up,
there. Let's,
and we could
let's
see.
back up and. Oh, jeez. I'm standardizing it here so we can think about it.
Well, sure, I can see.
Let's go back to.
So
There,
so
for
there, let's see, omega is both in the bottom two formula, and
So
I don't see any standardization of omega there.
But if I standardize that p to 1, which is what I would normally
Sure,
do.
if you then go and standardize p to 1, then omega is a multiple of it. But for these general expressions, it's
for the
not.
general expressions. But when I calculate examples, I've standardized p to 1. So, yeah. All right. Yeah. Where were we? Okay. Okay, in for a penny, in for a pound. If we're willing to do that approximation, we can also do this one, where we've assumed that we can approximate to a Gaussian individual selection surface. We can actually then calculate the distance to the optimum. And if we do that and get a distribution, now we're down to a sample of 100 and almost 200 studies. Here we're saying how close is the trait mean in these many studies to the peak theta of the individual selection surface, and hence to the peak of the adaptive landscape. And the answer is we get this negative exponential distribution in which, generally speaking, we're within a couple of phenotypic standard deviations of the mean. So in general, it's not like, this will come back, this will have reverberations when we think about things. It's not common to be light years away from the adaptive peak, it appears. I mean, here's a case in which we were appeared to be 37 phenotypic standard deviations away from the optimum. But generally, we seem to be a lot closer than that. And?
Question in the back.
Question in the back, yeah? You want to go back here before I...
Sorry, this is a stupid question.
No stupid questions.
Does omega, the strength of selection, does it change with the distance you are from the optimum?
No.
Okay.
No, but beta does. Right, because it's the first derivative. But these functions are going to have the same curvature everywhere. Well, no. In the Gaussian case, yeah.
Another question back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me back up here. Let me get. out of here. Jeez, what is going on? Yeah, okay, we're not going ahead.
Yeah, this one. But if you are also, I mean, more than 10 standard deviation from the mean of the trait, it means that selection must be basically 0. Otherwise, there can be any survival of individuals. Because we are so far away from the trait.
Here?
Well, but also less than that. If we think about two standard deviation is a lot, because we got one every 1,000 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Now remember, think about the selection studies, right? They're not measuring lifetime fitness. They're measuring some component of fitness, which might be snapshot survival, during a drought, or even a shorter interval of viability selection or fertility selection. So it's not as if we have a literature in which we can compile lifetime snapshots of selection and look at this. That's what we'd like to do. And then we could make the interpretation that you're making.
Yeah, no.
But this is a collage of many, many fitness measures.
No, I see, but
Yeah.
you're saying that selection must be very, very small, because otherwise, if you consider, for example, survival from age-specific,
But look at what we're seeing. We're
most of them.
I mean, maybe it's not surprising that it's a negative exponential distribution, but yeah. All right. Okay. Ready? Okay. So if then we put those two things together and say, okay, given that distribution of distances from the optimum, let's take the modal distance from the optimum, and the modal value for the width of the adaptive landscape. What would that picture look like? And here's the picture of a modal situation. From those, there are several approximations back of it. For a trait distribution, I didn't do that. It's hard to believe that you didn't cause that pop-up with your pointer when it does that, but anyway, see it doesn't happen now? I'm trying to convince myself. Here's a trait distribution with a unit phenotypic standard deviation. We're going to call it sigma here. The trait mean, the modal position of the trait mean with respect to the peak of the adaptive landscape, it turns out to be 1.1 phenotypic standard deviations away, and I can't remember what this value is. It's like 3 or 4 for the width of the for the variance, if you like, of this adaptive landscape relative to that variance of 1. For what it's worth, that's our view of the adaptive landscape from our survey. Okay, but we're here today, as usual, to talk about the multivariate case. And finally, we're there. And how long is my lecture going on? Am I done now? All right, let's just forget the multivariate case. All right. But we've had a little bit of discussion. So if we go lecture plus discussion, when am I done? When are we done? 10:30? 10:50? Okay, maybe I can do this in 15 minutes. But we'll ask plenty of questions, and then we'll all feel good that we had a lecture plus discussion, okay? You have a half hour. I've got a half hour. Yeah, okay. And then what do we have after that? Then we go to our... Well, we're going to take a break. There will be a break in half an hour, okay? We're not going to just go right there, All right. So let's go to the multivariate case, and we're going to illustrate it as always. Well, I'll give you an example in 3 dimensions. Here's a hypothetical bivariate example, and this is going to be I think this is you'll see it in the notes, but this is a Gaussian bivariate selection surface, and Adam has shown one of those before. Here's the optimum in this position. So this is trait values 1 deviating from 0 here. Here are trait values 2 deviating from 0 here. And I think I put the optimum right at 0. And you can look in the caption to see what the width parameter is here. I can't remember what it is. And we're in orange. But this is a realistic value, I mean, relative to those histograms we were looking at. And so that's the kind of curvature we're thinking about relative to standard deviations on the 2 trait axes. So here are some examples in bivariate space then. And what I'm showing is, I'm showing trait bivariate 95% confidence ellipses in blue for the trait ellipse distribution before selection, and then in black for the trait distribution after selection. And then we did these when we talked about the sort of algebra of a selection, and I didn't tell you what selection moved the distributions. And now I've shown you in orange the actual ISSs, the individual selection surfaces. And I've given you both the gammas and the omegas for those surfaces, so we can immediately tell from that these must be Gaussian. These must be Gaussian surfaces. And I've also shown you betas and S and gamma too. So there's lots to ponder there later on. But you can see that our general point is that an individual selection surface can shift the mean, and it can track the variances in both dimensions, and it can also change the trait covariance. And here you can see in our off-diagonal terms, it's only these two surfaces over here that have off-diagonal terms that are non-zero, and so it wouldn't be surprising to see the covariance shifted. But I haven't shown you that on the figure, just so it isn't completely busy. All right. All right. So yeah.
Stupid question.
No.
How can you tell immediately that they are Gaussian from the matrices?
Because otherwise I wouldn't be giving you the omega matrix.
Okay. Right.
I could be lying when I did that, but I wouldn't do that.
Right, of course.
So for example, just to make a point, in this case, we've got an individual selection surface, and before selection we sit right under the optimum, right? Bivariate. Beta is 0, 0, right? Just as you would anticipate. So if you like, beta is like a location term. It tells you where you are relative to the optimum. And omega and gamma are like shape matrices that tell you what the surface looks like. So it is kind of a tragedy that in the empirical literature, everybody estimates beta, which is this thing that is telling you almost always you're close to the optimum, and neglects. It's not going to be a surprise. You might be 37 standard deviations away, but they're probably going to be pretty close to zero. The really interesting thing, I think, is what is the shape of that selection surface. And so we have only a small number of studies that actually do that. And years ago I would complain about this, but then I realized nobody was listening to me, so I stopped. I will write a book and complain about it one more time, I think. All right, so where are we here? Now we want to think about these first derivatives and second derivatives on the individual selection surface. So let's just think about our notation. When you think of a point, whatever the surface is like in 2 dimensions, you've got 2 trait dimensions, so there's more than one slope at that point, right? It's a vector. There's a slope in trait 1 dimension and a trait in the second dimension. Bam, bam. So it's going to be a vector. And when you think about second derivative, less obviously, it's also a matrix. There's a curvature dimension in trait 1. There's a curvature term for curvature second derivative in the second trait dimension. And then there's a less obvious orientation parameter that tells you how you torque in 2 dimensions, and that's what this thing is. And this multivariate off-diagonal term is telling you about the orientation of the whole surface, and it's the term that has to do with affecting covariances between traits. It's the term that is interesting to us if we like to think about integration of traits. Okay, just a little multivariate calculus. And so here's our terms for the slope and for gamma. And you can see we're always talking about, woo, woo, but calm down and focus on just one element in the vector at a time. And you can see this is our familiar. It's not scary, is it? Or you feel your heart rate subsiding? Yeah. Here's our off-diagonal term that we're learning to love. See, it's got that cross product looking. I wouldn't look at this right before bed. When you can look at this right before bed and fall asleep, that's a good sign. All right, let's do approximations to the multivariate individual selection surface. We can write a general expression for the linear approximation, and beta transpose would be then a whole row of betas multiplied by a whole column of z's, right? So it would be a big string of terms. And I've written out the two terms that would be there in the two-trait case. So in the two-trait case, this is our equation for a straight line, a plane, fitted to the individual selection surface. It gets a little scarier when we go to, so here's you've got these nice quadratic forms, which you can learn to love. I've always liked collaborating with Pat Phillips because his initials are PCP. And so I'm always looking for a collaborator whose initials have a quadratic form, if anyone has initials like that. No? Okay. If yes, we can talk. So here's the quadratic approximation. Here are the first two terms that give us a plane, and then you can think of these three terms as giving us deviations from that plane. Now, the 1/2 terms are coming in for the variance terms, which are squared values of trait, and then when we look at the term for the cross product terms, it's like the orientation term. There's no 1/2 here. You would not know that from the empirical literature. About half the time people put in a half. Sometimes they put in a 2, sometimes they do it right. Anyway, so all right, so here's the surprising thing. If your trait distribution is multivariate normal before selection, and you can transform it, so that's approximately true, this approximation to the surface will always give you an estimate of gamma and beta, regardless of what the surface is. Even if it's got bumps and grinds, this is still, this approximation to, this estimation formula for beta and gamma still works. Hard to believe. But there's, and we're going to talk about this in the exercise coming up, there's an important proviso. Let me just tell you what you're going to do. The best way to estimate the betas is to do a linear approximation first and estimate the betas here, and then do a quadratic approximation and estimate the gammas, the 3 gammas in the two-trait case from here. Now I'm going to give you an almost unintelligible explanation for why that's so. If the trait distribution before selection is not quite normal, and in particular if it's skewed, then these squared terms will be correlated with the unsquared terms, and that covariance will distort the estimates of the betas, but not the gammas. And so you'll get a slightly screwed up estimate of betas, and this will give you the proper estimate of betas up here. So I'm not going to say that again, but you can read, this is from a paper by Landy and Arnold in 1983, and there's an excruciating discussion of multivariate skewness. And I knew that this was excruciating when Brian Charlesworth read the whole paper, and that's the one section that he seized on. He thought that the tragedy of multivariate skewness was so wonderful that he actually dived into it, and spent some hours playing with it one evening. But I was happy to forget about it, but Brian found it intriguing. So anyway, that's the heartbreak of multivariate skewness, and there are other ways to deal with it, but
one of the problems here is that if Z1 and Z2 are correlated, the estimate of the beta is tricky.
it's tricky.
Yeah.
Not if our trait distributions are approximately normal.
But if they are correlated between the two, beta 1 and beta 2 can take different values.
Well, remember we showed that beta, the estimation that beta corrects for the correlation between characters. This is the same beta. This is the same beta that we were using in the last lecture. This is the same beta that is estimated as P inverse S. So let me say it. These are partial regression coefficients. So in that sense, they correct for the correlation among characters that are included in the estimation. Okay? It's not obvious from just looking at this, but I mean, this is the standard way of estimating a partial regression coefficients, for example. And that's exactly what beta is.
Because in the last, I think, it's working? Yeah. There's probably a couple of years there have been some modification to the estimation procedure for the traits, just to correct for that potential problem.
Oh yeah, no, that was the original inspiration for well, so let me back up. So think back to our expression for beta. We had a result that beta is equal to P minus 1S. And I made a big point about S being a covariance matrix, covariance term or a covariance matrix. P minus 1S then is the standard expression for a vector of partial regression coefficients. And so I'm not making a new claim that now this correction of beta these estimates of beta are correct for the correlations among traits. That's a standard result for multivariate stat. You can find it in standard books. Anyway, so I'm not waving my hands or claiming that this is original. All right, okay. Yeah. Am I at the right place? Jeez, I don't know why I can't. I think I'm in the right place. So if we're doing this, Schluter's concern, let's come back to that. What can we represent with a quadratic surface? Well, in general, I've shown you, when I want to illustrate it, I generally show a stabilizing selection function. And the reason I do that is, what you'll see as we go into deep time, we're going to try and account for the fact that most trait means and lineages show very little evolution over long periods of evolutionary time. Empirical fact. Well, I'll show it later. A natural way to account for that is to imagine that stabilizing selection with a peak close to the mean is a routine fact of nature. And so that draws me naturally to this kind of idea for the approximation. That's what I've got in the back of my mind, and what most of the theoretical literature has in its mind too. But a quadratic surface could look like a saddle, or it could look like a level or ascending or declining ridge, or it could take any of a variety of shapes. And so that's useful to keep in mind. It's also useful to keep in mind that minor changes in the values of the gamma coefficients can change you from this to this to this. Changes at the second decimal place.
Did you say it changes to beta?
Gamma. Remember, beta is just your location on this surface, yeah. At any rate, so consult the notes for that point. But you can also ask then, what about 3 dimensions? Let's get out of the bivariate space for just a moment and look at 3 dimensions. And so now we have nested surfaces representing that 3rd dimension. So now think about Adam and my favorite stabilizing Gaussian surface in 2 dimensions. What does it look like in 3 dimensions? where we've got the z dimension coming out of the board. What? What, Dave? A sphere. I like to think of an onion, because, or maybe an artichoke. But in any case, right at the center of the onion is the optimum, right? And as you go out on the layers of the onion, you're looking at fitness contours coming out. Like it? Or maybe in the third dimension, there's literally no selection on the trait, right? But in the other two dimensions, there's the standard stabilizing selection that we've been looking at. Then you would get a pipe like this. And next to the onion, the pipe is my favorite, right? And I'm thinking, you know, if you've got a trait, a third trait, that where selection is extremely weak, it might not be a pipe, but it would be the surface would be a very long cigar, a very long set of nested cigars. At any rate, and then, you know, some people love the sort of linearized version of a saddle and so forth. And anyway, but all of these things are possible. There's no torus here, as far as I know. Not with Gaussian, but anyway. All right. Yep.
You just said that in the three trait case with no selection on the third trait, it was a pipe. But why couldn't you just use the two trait case?
You couldn't what?
Why couldn't you just use the two trait? Why wouldn't it be just two traits?
I may be misunderstanding what I'm saying. Imagine there are three traits. You're trying to conceptualize selection in three dimensions.
Yeah.
And in one of your dimensions, the trait just happens to not affect fitness at all. Then, yeah.
I see. So you can just cut a plane through that, and then that would just be the
You
two
could,
trait
but
case.
I'm thinking of this dimension as being that third. Yeah, anyway. I think I said Gaussian, but I meant quadratic. I mean, so what we're talking about is how general is the kind of surfaces. It's pretty general. I mean, there are a lot of different shapes in 2, 3. And of course, the fourth dimension, you know, you could represent with time and do animations. Maybe I should do that. All right. Okay, same point that we made in single trait space. If you're really worried about the actual shape of the surface rather than just trying to estimate parameters beta and gamma, you might go. So here's Schluter and Nishka doing a cubic spline for the case of human birth weight mass as a function of gestation period, and it's sort of it's a unimodal bivariate surface, but it's a lot flatter and a lot more curved and interesting than you would get with a quadratic approximation. And so, you know, I go, okay, you know, I've been a parent. I prefer this surface to the quadratic approximation. So that's a good point. Multivariate adaptive landscape. These are, we're in the interest of having a few questions at the end. As before, we get a window on the adaptive landscape. We get a perspective from beta on the first derivative of the adaptive landscape in the vicinity of the bivariate multivariate mean, and we get a perspective from gamma minus beta beta transpose on the curvature of the adaptive landscape at that one point. This is in general without making any Gaussian assumptions. So we can know a little about adaptive landscapes in as many dimensions as we want. And here's the this is going to be worth looking at briefly. So here's the expression for a multivariate adaptive landscape, Gaussian individual selection surface, and then here's the Gaussian adaptive landscape that we get by assuming this and assuming that the trait distribution is multivariate Gaussian before selection. And so the point is, when you look at this omega plus p term, it's a matrix. And it's the matrix that's playing the same role that omega plays in the individual selection surface, right? And so it means that these variance-like terms that are describing the width of the surface are a little bit bigger. The variances are a little bit bigger. The quote variances are a little bit bigger, but it depends by a factor of p. So if you're standardizing to 1 for the 2 trait variances before selection, your Gaussian adaptive landscape is not a lot bigger than the individual selection surface, even if omega 1 is 10, it's going to be 11 instead of 10. It's not going to look much flatter. Okay, and I'm beginning to wonder about how many slides I got. I think we're getting to the end. Okay, so Adam actually did this quickly. One of the things we can do is we can characterize the ISS and the adaptive landscape by taking eigenvectors or principal components of the omega or the omega plus p matrices, right? Those are the matrices that are describing the shape of the surface. And so we can represent the whole surface by that pair of axes and by the eigenvalues along those axes, which are analogous to variances or variance-like width parameters, right? So, and we'll do this in our exercise this afternoon. Once we've estimated gamma, we can take the eigenvalues of the gamma matrix and draw the axes of the ISS or the Gaussian approximation to that, and that'll tell us what the axes of the selection surface are. And we can get, anyway, we can draw, and then we can draw an ellipse that represents that surface. And since the ellipses are nested, the shape is going to be the same no matter what contour we're walking on. That's just a property of Gaussian and quadratic surfaces. Couple of, really just one example. So here's a study by Brody of the effects of stripedness and anti-predator behavior on survivorship in a natural population of garter snakes. This is an interesting case in which a certain combination of these 2 traits very much improves fitness. And the combinations that work best in this garter snake case are being blotched and crawling on a straight line, being blotched and turning like this when a predator tries to attack you, or the next best thing is to have a stripe and crawl in a straight line. Now, we know from studying garter snakes and other snakes that crawling straight with a straight line creates the optical illusion of standing still. And every herpetologist that's tried to catch striped snakes, or every child, will tell you this is true, because you try and grab one of these snakes and you go, and it's up there. It doesn't look like it's moving. But if you're a blotch snake, that doesn't work at all. And so the best thing to do is either be cryptic or just try and take a new position and just freeze. And that's the reversal thing. At any rate, doing the opposite thing, being mismatched, is very bad on your fitness. But at any rate, you get a saddle when you estimate the ISS. I'm giving you an abbreviated count here. And then in the case of garter snake vertebral numbers, here's body and tail. Are you going to talk about these examples in your exercise, Paul? A little bit. So unfortunately, I didn't correct it. So this is tail vertebrae on this axis, body vertebrae on this axis, and then this surface is, I have to remember which is which. On the left, this is growth rate in one species of garter snakes in females, and you can see the best thing is to be on this line somewhere, and as you fall off from that line, having mismatched numbers of body and tail vertebrae, your growth rate in the field falls off. And if we look at crawling speed, fitness also falls off as you deviate from a similar line. So this kind of a result that you've got the best fitness combination is on a line, that's a sign that the off-diagonal term, omega 1, 2, is having an effect on the surface. And in these 2 studies, that's the term that's especially significant when we do estimation. I think we're going to do we're going to do this one in our estimation, and we're going to see how stable that picture is as we bootstrap over the sample of garter snakes to give this surface as a point estimate. So we'll come back to this. Here's a survey done by Blows and Brooks in 2003. There aren't a lot of studies that actually, as I've said, that estimate surfaces. And here's studies in which I think I've dropped. At any rate, let me just skip to the bottom line. Saddles in the first most important couple of dimensions of the trait dimensions are extremely common. Here's a bowl is what we would describe as, that's what I was expecting empirically. Peaks and bowls are far outnumbered by saddles in the empirical literature. And Paul and I used to wring our hands together about why this was so. It's still a troubling result, isn't it? But one with multiple possible explanations. It would be wonderful if someone in this room cracked the problem once and for all, wouldn't it be, Paul? And pause for a few more sections so you can think about it.
The disquieting implication of the saddle, if you accept the quadratic approximation, which you should not, is that as you go off in one direction, fitness gets higher and higher and higher, no matter how far you go. So that immediately has to lead you to think it isn't really it's a locally a saddle, and then it's coming back down at some point.
Yeah. You know, what I tend to think is that the surface moves with you, or put another way, that the surface is moving out there and you're tracking it, and you're close to the, but that's disquieting. It means you are apparently close to the pit, the pessimum. It's troubling. Okay. It'll keep you awake at night. Okay. Oh, so I had the right lessons. So selection can be described with surfaces. Some approximations, but not all, enable us to estimate parameters of selection beta and gamma, and they're pretty robust to assumptions about what kind of surface you've got. I mean, it might be poorly approximated, but still you can estimate beta and gamma, and I used to argue with reviewers about that. In addition, those same parameters, beta and gamma, also tell us about the adaptive landscape. So it means that the adaptive landscape is an empirically visible concept. It's not something that's just anchored out there in fantasy land. And there are a few references, and we've got time for a few questions too.